She was driving down an empty, frozen road when something caught her eye, a dark figure among the trees. Her heart pounded as she realized what it was. A German shepherd tied to a tree, covered in snow, barely moving, who could do something. This cruel, she slammed on the brakes, jumped out of the car and ran toward the dog. But when she tried to free him, she realized the rope was frozen solid. Digging into his skin, the dog was weak, his eyes lifeless. She had to act fast. But what she did next was shocking and changed everything. Sarah Mitchell gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white from the cold, even with the heater blasting. The icy wind creeping through the cracks of her car made her shiver. The thermometer on the dashboard flashed 4 degrees to 20. The road stretched endlessly ahead, empty except for the occasional snow-covered tree bending under the weight of the storm. She sighed, desperate to get home before the weather worsened, but then something caught her eye to the right. Just past the line of trees, a dark figure stood out against the snow. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She slowed the car, her breath fogging up the windshield. As the headlights swept over the figure, her stomach twisted. It wasn't a shadow, it was a dog, a German shepherd tied to a tree, barely moving, his body covered in snow. Sarah's pulse skyrocketed. She slammed the brakes and jumped out of the car, the freezing wind cutting through her coat like a knife. She didn't care. She sprinted toward the dog, her boots crunching. Against the frozen ground, every second mattered as she got closer. The full horror of the situation hit her like a punch to the chest. The German shepherd was motionless, his fur stiff with ice, his ribs visible beneath his matted coat. The rope around his neck was so tight and frozen that it looked like a noose. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She dropped to her knees in the snow beside him. "Hey, buddy, can you hear me?" The dog didn't move. She reached out, her fingers trembling, and pressed them gently against his side, a faint rise and fall. He was still alive. Sarah exhaled sharply, her hands shaking. She had to get him out of here. She grabbed the rope, pulling desperately, but it wouldn't budge. The ice had sealed it tight. It was as if someone had tied him up and left him to die. Her stomach twisted in anger. "Hold on, buddy," she whispered, her breath visible in the cold air. She ripped off her gloves, her fingers instantly burning from the freezing rope. She tried to loosen the knot, but it was rock solid, frozen into the bark of the tree. Panic surged in her chest. The dog shuddered weakly, a faint whimper escaping his cracked, dry lips. His eyes were open now, but there was no fight left in them. Sarah felt her throat tighten. She couldn't let him die like this. She scanned the area, frantically. She needed something, anything, to cut the rope. But then the dog did something unexpected. Even with barely any strength left, he lifted his head just an inch and looked at her. His eyes, hollow and dull, locked onto hers, and for the first time she saw it, the smallest flicker of hope. But Sarah had no idea what was still to come. The cold bit at Sarah's exposed fingers as she desperately clawed at the frozen rope, but it wouldn't budge. It was like trying to break a chain made of ice. The German shepherd lay completely still, his breath shallow and weak. His fur was stiff with frost, his body barely responding to her touch. Sarah gritted her teeth. She didn't have time to hesitate. "Stay with me, buddy," she murmured, her voice trembling, not just from the cold, but from fear. How long had he been out here? Her fingers burned from the freezing rope, but she didn't stop pulling at the knot. It was buried in ice, completely locked in place. She needed something sharp. Frantically, she looked around. Snow-covered branches, chunks of ice, nothing useful, until her eyes landed on her car keys. It wasn't much, but it was all she had. She yanked them from her pocket and jammed the metal into the icy knot, twisting, scraping anything to loosen it. The German shepherd whimpered softly, barely lifting his head. His body shuddered, but there was no fight left in him. Sarah's heart clenched. The thought hit her like a slap. If she didn't get him out of here now, he wouldn't make it. She twisted the key harder. Her knuckles scraped raw from the ice. Finally a crack. The ice splintered, breaking just enough for her to pull at the rope again, but it still wouldn't come loose. Tears burned behind her eyes as she let out a frustrated breath. Come on, she wasn't giving up. Sarah pulled harder, using all the strength she had left. The rope burned against her palms, but she kept going, her arm shaking from the effort. Then a sudden snap. The knot gave way, the rope unraveled, falling from the dog's neck, like a shackle breaking apart. Sarah barely had a second to react before the shepherd collapsed into the snow. Her heart stopped for a terrifying moment. He didn't move, his body lay limp, his breathing almost non-existent. No, come on, buddy, she gasped quickly, pulling off her coat and wrapping it around his fragile body. His fur was cold to the touch, his body barely holding on to life. She pressed her hand gently against his chest, feeling for movement, a faint rise and fall. He was alive, but just barely. Sarah's mind raced. She had freed him, but that wasn't enough. If she didn't get him warm now, he wasn't going to make it. She had no choice. Bending down, she wrapped her arms around the shepherd and lifted him. He was so light, too light for a dog his size. He let out a weak whimper as she cradled him against her body, trying to share her warmth. Got you, she whispered. I'm not letting you go. The freezing wind cut against her skin as she staggered back toward the car. She didn't know if she was already too late. She didn't know if he could hold on, but she did know one thing. She wasn't leaving him behind. Sarah barely felt the icy wind biting her skin as she staggered back to the car, clutching the limp German shepherd against her chest. His body was too light, too still. It was like carrying a sack of bones wrapped in frozen fur. His breathing was so faint she could barely feel it. Stay with me, buddy, she whispered, her voice shaking as she yanked the car door open and carefully laid him across the passenger seat. The cold air rushed inside, and for a terrifying second she thought she felt him shudder one last time, then go still. Her breath caught in her throat. No. Her hands shook as she reached for his chest, pressing her palm against his ribs. A pause, then the faintest rise and fall. He was still alive, but she was losing him. Sarah jumped into the driver's seat, cranking the heater to full blast. Before gripping the wheel with numb fingers, she floored the gas. The tires screeched against the icy road as she sped forward, her heart hammering. Every second mattered. The nearest vet clinic was at least 20 minutes away. She didn't have 20 minutes. Sarah's eyes darted to the shepherd beside her. His eyes were half open but unfocused, staring blankly ahead. His breathing was barely there. She had to do something now. Her mind raced. She had to warm him up. She reached across the seat, grabbing the edges of her thick winter coat and pulling it tighter around him. She switched the vents to blast hot air toward him, but it wasn't enough. His body was still ice cold. Her hands trembled as she pressed her fingers against the side of his neck. He barely had a pulse. Terror squeezed her chest. He was slipping away. Then a desperate idea hit her. She yanked off her gloves and pressed her bare hands against his frozen ribs. The contact made her gasp. His skin was like ice, but she didn't pull away. She leaned over slightly, keeping one hand on the wheel and the other on his chest. Come on, buddy, she whispered. Stay with me. The car sped through the dark road, the headlights barely cutting through the freezing. Minutes passed. He didn't move. Sarah bit her lip so hard she tasted blood. Then a weak, raspy sound. Her eyes widened. She glanced down. The shepherd's nose twitched slightly. A faint, broken whimper escaped his throat. Sarah's breath hitched. That's it. She choked out, her heart pounding. She pressed her palm against his side again. His body was still too cold, but he was fighting. She wasn't going to let him lose. She slammed her foot on the gas, her car barreling through the icy road toward the vet clinic. She didn't care if she had to break every speed limit in town. She wasn't going to let him die. Sarah's car screeched to a stop in front of the vet clinic. Tires skidding slightly on the icy pavement, the fluorescent emergency sign flickered against the dark night, casting a cold glow over the entrance. She barely threw the car into park before flinging the door open and rushing to the passenger seat. The German Shepherd wasn't moving. Her stomach dropped. "Hey, I need help!" she yelled, her voice cracking as she wrapped her arms around the limp dog and pulled. Exposed skin as she staggered toward the door. Her legs felt numb, her breath short, but she refused to stop. The clinic. Doors burst open and a woman in scrubs and a winter coat rushed out. "Bring him inside," she ordered, her eyes widening at the sight of the dog's fragile body. Sarah stumbled into the clinic, the warm air instantly enveloping her. She didn't realize how cold she was until now, but she wasn't the one in danger. The vet tech directed her toward a treatment table where another staff member was already preparing supplies. Sarah laid the shepherd down carefully. He didn't react. The machine next to the table beeped as the vet tech pressed a stethoscope against the dog's frail chest. The woman's face tightened. His breathing was shallow. Too slow, his body was stiff from the cold. Sarah clenched her fists. He was tied to a tree. I found him freezing out there. The rope was so tight I thought. She stopped herself, shaking her head. I don't know how long he was out there, but he barely made it. The vetitech nodded, her expression grim. "We're going to do everything we can." Then an urgent voice. "Get Dr. Carter in here now." Sarah's chest tightened. A tall woman in a white coat rushed into the room, her brown hair tied back in a messy bun. "Dr. Emily Carter, the head veterinarian." "What's his temperature?" Dr. Carter asked sharply. A nurse checked the screen and grimaced, too low to read. Sarah's heart dropped. Dr. Carter's expression remained calm, but her voice was firm. "We need to warm him up immediately. IV fluids, heat pads, and get the oxygen ready now." Sarah stepped back, her pulse racing as the team sprang into action. She watched as warm blankets were wrapped around the shepherd's frail body, a catheter inserted into his leg, and an oxygen mask placed gently over his muzzle. She clenched her hands into fists. He had to make it, minute, stretched into eternity as the team worked. Dr. Carter checked the shepherd's heartbeat, her eyes narrowing. His pulse is weak, but stable for now. Sarah swallowed hard. Is he going to survive? Dr. Carter exhaled slowly. It's too soon to tell. Sarah's chest tightened painfully, but the vet continued, glancing at the dog's frail body. He's still fighting. Sarah's breath hitched. That was enough for now. It was enough. She placed a hand on the edge of the table, whispering, "You're not alone anymore." But the shepherd didn't respond, but for the first time, his ears twitched slightly. Sarah sat in the dimly lit waiting room, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had turned white. The rhythmic ticking of the wall clock echoed in her ears. Each second stretching unbearably. She had done everything she could. Now it was up to him. The German shepherd lay in the treatment room beyond the closed doors, wrapped in heated blankets, an IV delivering warm fluids into his frail body. She had barely noticed that her coat and gloves were soaked from the snow, or that her fingers burned from the cold. All she cared about was whether he would make it. Then the door creaked open. Sarah jumped to her feet. Dr. Carter stepped out, her white coat slightly wrinkled, her expression unreadable. Sarah's breath caught. He's still with us? Sarah's knees almost buckled in relief. He's extremely weak, Dr. Carter continued, but his vitals have stabilized slightly. His temperature is rising. That's a good sign. Sarah let out a shaky breath. Can I see him? Dr. Carter hesitated for a moment before nodding. He's still unconscious, but I think he could use someone by his side. Sarah didn't waste a second. She followed the vet into the treatment room, her heart hammering. The shepherd lay motionless on the padded table, his frail body wrapped tightly in blankets, A small oxygen mask rested over his muzzle, and the soft beeping of the monitors filled the air. Sarah swallowed hard. He looked so fragile. She slowly approached, standing beside him. "Hey, buddy," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The dog didn't move. Her chest tightened, a lump forming in her throat. What if she had been too late? But then a small flicker. His ear twitched. Sarah froze, then his eyelids fluttered just slightly. She gasped softly, her fingers curling into the blanket beside him. "That's it, you're okay now." His breathing was still weak, but he was fighting. Dr. Carter stepped forward, her voice softer this time. "He needs time. His body is in shock and he's extremely malnourished. We'll run tests to check for internal damage, but for now, the most important thing is that he's alive." Sarah nodded, her throat tight with emotion. She glanced at the shepherd's fragile body. Someone had done this to him. Someone had left him to die in the freezing cold, tied up and helpless. Her fingers instinctively brushed against the dog's matted fur. She had to find out who. Then Dr. Carter spoke again. "We checked for a microchip." Sarah's head snapped up, and the vet hesitated. "He has one." Sarah's breath hitched, and then Dr. Carter looked at her, her expression unreadable. "The owner is someone local." Sarah's stomach dropped. Someone in this town had done this, and now she was going to find out who. Sarah's mind raced as she stared at Dr. Carter. A microchip that meant this dog wasn't just some abandoned stray. Someone had owned him. Someone had left him to die. Her hands curled into fists. "Who does he belong to?" Dr. Carter hesitated, glancing at the unconscious shepherd, wrapped in blankets. "Legally, I can't give out personal details without reporting it." "First," she said carefully, "but I can tell you this, his registered owner is from this town." Sarah felt a wave of anger boil beneath her exhaustion. She swallowed hard. "Do you know if they've reported him missing?" Dr. Carter exhaled sharply. "No." Sarah's breath hitched. "No report, no lost posters. Whoever owned him never wanted him back. Do you have a name?" she asked, her voice quieter now. Dr. Carter's lips pressed into a thin line before she finally nodded. "Yes." Sarah braced herself, and then she heard it, and her blood ran cold. She knew that name. It took a second to process, but when it hit hard. "No," she whispered. "That can't be right." Dr. Carter's expression was grim. "I double-checked." Sarah's stomach churned. She hadn't just heard the name. Before she had met the man, he was a respected business owner in town, someone people trusted, and yet he had left this dog to die. Her fingers trembled as she looked down at the shepherd, his frail body barely moving under the blankets. How could anyone do this to him? She swallowed the lump in her throat. "What happens now?" she asked Dr. Carter, crossed her arms legally. "We have to notify the registered owner before placing the dog in anyone else's care." Sarah's heart pounded. "You're telling me we have to call him Dr. Carter? Hesitated if we don't. And he comes looking for the dog later. It could complicate things, but based on what you found, I don't think he's going to want him back." Sarah exhaled slowly, her head spinning. Her gut told her this wasn't just neglect, something worse had happened. She looked back at the shepherd, his breathing still slow, his body still weak, and in that moment she knew she wasn't going to let him go back, not to a man who had left him tied to a tree in the freezing cold, not to someone who had abandoned him to die. Sarah clenched her jaw. "I want to adopt him," Dr. Carter blinked in surprise. "Sarah, he's in rough shape. He may never fully recover." "I don't care." Dr. Carter studied her for a long moment, then her expression softened. "We see what happens when we make the call," she said. "But if the owner refuses to claim him, he's yours." Sarah felt her pulse hammering, because she already knew the truth. No one was coming for him, and maybe that was for the best. Sarah sat rigidly in the small office inside the clinic, her hands clenched into fists as Dr. Carter dialed the number. The room was eerily quiet except for the soft beeping of the heart monitor from the treatment room. Beyond the door, the German shepherd, her dog, now in every way that mattered, was still fighting for his life, and now she was about to hear the voice of the man who had tried to end it. Dr. Carter pressed the phone to her ear. Sarah could hear it ringing once, twice, then a voice. Yeah, the tone was gruff, impatient. Dr. Carter's expression didn't change. "Hello, this is Dr. Emily Carter from Westfield Veterinary Clinic. We have a dog registered to your name." The man cut her off. Immediately. "What dog?" Sarah's blood ran cold. Dr. Carter's voice remained calm. "A German shepherd. He was found tied to a tree and freezing temperatures and nearly died. He's chipped under your name." Silence. Sarah held her breath. Then the man laughed, a short, bitter chuckle. "Oh, that mutt," he scoffed. "I got rid of him days ago." Sarah's jaw clenched so hard it hurt. "Got rid of him?" "Do, Carter," repeated her voice, dangerously measured. "Yeah," the man continued carelessly. "He was useless. Weak. I don't need a dog that can't." He stopped himself, then sighed. "Look, do what you want with him. I don't care." Sarah felt sick. Every ounce of her self-control was hanging by a thread. Dr. Carter, to her credit, remained professional. "So you're surrendering ownership?" "I don't give a damn," the man muttered. "You're not mine anymore." Sarah couldn't take it. She grabbed the phone from Dr. Carter's hand. "You tied him to a tree and left him to die," she said, her voice shaking with anger. The man hesitated, then he snorted. "Lady, it's just a dog!" Sarah's hands trembled. Dr. Carter gently took the phone back before Sarah could say what she really wanted to. "We'll take care of him," she said flatly, before hanging up. The call ended. Sarah sat there, heart hammering. Breathing hard, Dr. Carter exhaled. "Well, that's that." Sarah swallowed back the rage burning in her chest. "So he's mine now?" she asked, her voice still raw. Dr. Carter nodded, a small, knowing smile playing on her lips. "He's yours!" Sarah let out a shaky breath. Then a noise from the treatment room, a soft whimper. Sarah's head snapped toward the door. She didn't hesitate, rushing back into the room. She found the shepherd still wrapped in blankets, his frail body barely moving. But his eyes were open, really open. Not dull, not lifeless. He was looking at her for the first time he saw her. Sarah's throat tightened. She slowly reached out, placing a gentle hand on his head. He didn't flinch. Instead, his weak tail thumped against the table. Sarah let out a soft, broken laugh, tears burning in her eyes. "Oh, you're safe now, buddy," she whispered. And this time, he believed her. Rex was left to die, but he refused to give up, and neither did Sarah now. After everything he's been through, he finally has a second chance at life. What do you think should happen next in Rex's journey? Let us know in the comments. And if this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share, so more people can hear stories of resilience, hope, and second chances. Say